Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Cost of Quality in the Medical Laboratory 2020. I'm Susie Valdez of Labroots, and I will be your moderator for today's event. This educational web seminar is sponsored by Biorad Laboratories. I want to invite everyone to participate by submitting your questions during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen and click Send. Any questions we do not have time for during the webinar will be captured and responded through the Q&A list and will be posted in next week's in the Event Resources box, which is located below the Ask a Question box. You will also be able to download the presentation handouts from the Event Resources box starting on November 20th. If you have any trouble seeing or hearing this presentation, simply contact us through the Ask a Question box and we will address your issue. As a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free PACE continuing education credits. Click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located at the top right-hand corner of your presentation window and follow the instructions to obtain those credits. So let's get started. I want to now present today's speaker, Dr. Lucia Berte. Ms. Berte has a Bachelor of Science degree in Medical Technology and a Master's degree in Healthcare Administration. In addition to being an American Society for Clinical Pathology certified medical technologist, specialist in blood banking, and diplomate in laboratory management, she is also certified as a quality manager and quality auditor by the American Society for Quality. She was a co-leader for the ISO working group on ISO 15189 in 2012, which many recognize as the international standard for medical laboratory quality, and she currently serves on the team working to revise and update this standard. Ms. Berte has volunteered for the Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute for over 25 years in roles such as chairholder of the QMS Subcommittee and most recently co-chair of the Document Development Committee for QMS 20, Cost of Quality in Medical Laboratories. As a recognized expert on the cost of quality in medical laboratories, Ms. Berte has been invited to speak on this topic in many countries. For a complete biography on Ms. Lucia Berte, please visit the Biography tab at the top of your screen. Lucy, welcome. You may now begin your presentation.
Hello and good day to all of you. I thank Biorad for inviting me to share with you an understanding of quality costs in the medical laboratory, a subject about which I have been very passionate for many years. That's because laboratories have budgets, but most laboratories have no idea how much of their budget is spent in solving problems and repeating work. Here are the learning objectives for today's program. We will discuss each of 4 types of quality costs, and I will provide a number of laboratory examples for each. We will calculate the cost of poor quality for a defined laboratory problem. I have a couple examples for you of that. And we will link laboratory quality indicators to the cost of poor quality towards the end of the program. So the truth is, although most laboratory directors have some education about laboratory budgets, those programs probably have not included information about the cost of quality. So this quotation about companies and cost of quality was originally from the manufacturing industry, modified here by me for the laboratories. But if you consider that laboratories manufacture information from biologic raw materials, this quotation applies to laboratories as much as it applies to any other industry. So in this program, I'm going to talk about 4 types of quality costs and their application in the laboratory. You can see from the graphic in the upper right-hand corner that we're talking about money. In any symbol, in any country, anywhere around the world, these concepts apply. The first type of quality cost is prevention cost. The second type of quality cost is appraisal cost. These two costs support good laboratory quality products and services. The third type of laboratory cost is failure costs, and there's two types of failure costs. There are internal failure costs and external failure costs, and these costs arise from poor quality products and services. So this is an important concept to accept yourself and instill in your laboratory personnel. The lowest cost is to do the job correctly the first time, because it always costs more time and money to solve problems caused by an error. So here we are at our first cost, prevention cost. It's the first and the lowest of the four quality cost types, because preventing a problem from happening at all means we don't have to pay for fixing it later. It's shown here as two green lights for go, because this is a good way to spend your laboratory's budget. We do prevention costs when your laboratory designs its processes to prevent poor quality results and services. And that means we design to meet regulatory and accreditation, customer and organizational requirements from the beginning, so that we can produce the services and the products correctly the first time. Prevention cost is money spent for laboratory activities that prevent problems, errors, or waste from occurring in the first place. I know I said that once, but I can't help but say it again, because many people think it's the cost incurred to keep a problem from happening again, but it is not. Prevention costs do not keep a problem or error that has already occurred from recurring. So you should never say to prevent the problem from happening again. It's too late, it already happened. Here are some examples of medical laboratory prevention costs. So this is pretty intuitive. By definition, preventive maintenance is what's going to keep your laboratory instruments and equipment working and ensuring reliable performance. Quality planning. This quote is from the U.S. Army. Prior planning prevents poor performance. What it means is to plan in advance new or changed processes and not to implement new or changed things by memo. Work process training is the assigned processes and procedures to new employees or employees when there is a new or changed process. And we train them in how it works, how the new or changed process works. And if they're new employees, they're new assigned duties, so that when they work independently in the live environment, they know what they're supposed to do. And we verify that training with initial competence assessment. And that ensures that a new employee can work independently, or all employees, when there are new or changed processes, can do it correctly after training. And one of the last types of laboratory prevention costs are the quality improvement projects. And these meetings and these programs and these projects take time and money, but they're well worth it if they prevent problems from happening downstream. Now let's look at the second type of laboratory quality cost, and that's the appraisal cost. It's shown here as one green light instead of two, one green light, because although these costs support good quality products and services, it costs money to evaluate the quality of work after it's been performed. So appraise means to evaluate or to make a judgment on. And so we do the work first, and then we look to see, did we do what we were supposed to do? So appraisal costs are for laboratory activities that measure, evaluate, and audit to ensure conformance to requirements. And remember, I said there were 4 kinds of requirements. There are regulatory requirements, accreditation requirements, customer requirements, and organizational requirements. And these appraisal costs catch and correct problems and errors before the laboratory does something that could harm a patient. For example, the cost of a laboratory director's time to review a report of genetic testing results before the report is issued ensures that the report is correct and complete, because genetic information has very profound effects on the patient and the patient's offspring in the future. Now let's look at some examples of laboratory appraisal costs. And one of the first is the ongoing competence assessment. So once people are in the work environment, we need to ensure that they maintain their competence in their assigned job tasks throughout employment. Another appraisal cost is calibrations that are performed on measuring equipment and instruments because they support the accuracy of the results, test results. There are inspections of specimens and reagents before testing, and these ensure the quality of the inputs so that errors do not carry through the testing and the reporting processes. And then there is quality control. We all know that. Quality control ensures the testing methods are working and the results for that batch with that QC are valid and can be released. Proficiency testing is another appraisal cost. And of course, you know that that measures your laboratory methods results with laboratories of like kind for that same method. And then there are external accreditations. In the United States, we have the Joint Commission and the College of American Pathologists and the American Association of Blood Banks and COLA. And in the rest of the world, there is ISO 15189, which is the International Medical Laboratory Standard. But the important thing here is that these documents, these external accreditation assessments, are minimum standards for laboratory quality. Now we're going to shift over to the failure costs. And the third and fourth type of quality costs are the failure costs. And they're shown here with two red lights because that signals they are bad and they need to be stopped. So services that don't meet quality requirements the first time usually need to be done over again, and that drains your budget. Internal failure costs are incurred for problems that are caught and corrected inside your laboratory before the results and reports are released. And external failure costs are detected outside the laboratory by your customers, patients, users, practitioners who receive faulty results, reports, or other services. Poor quality is not free. The money paid in labor and materials to fix problems and errors is money wasted. So every time you have to do work over, the cost of quality increases. Let's look at some examples of laboratory internal failure costs. When the specimens received in the laboratory do not meet your laboratory's acceptance criteria, sometimes they need recollection. If laboratory people do the recollection, that is an internal failure cost coming out of your budget. When others recollect, like for example, a nurse care technician or a nurse, him or herself recollects the sample, there is still a cost to the laboratory for reaccessioning the recollected sample and reprocessing. So there's still money coming out of the laboratory's budget for that failure. An invalid instrument run is defined as when QC or calibration is out of control and you cannot release the results. And that's different from an incomplete examination or test run, where there's a technical problem like an alarm or the instrument shuts down for overheating or some reason so that the examinations cannot be completed and the results still cannot be reported. expired reagents and materials are not supposed to be used in phlebotomy or examinations. And when they are, it means that your laboratory's inventory management system is not working the way it should work. So it costs money to catch and correct that problem and repeat everything before the results can be considered valid. And anything that causes delays in turnaround time, like rework, retest, repair, and the downtime of any instruments or the laboratory's information management system. We give one red light to internal failure costs because the laboratory has a chance to find and fix these errors before they hurt a patient. And that's important. But the worst and the most expensive cost is when a customer notifies the laboratory of a problem. And so here are some examples of external failure costs. Customer complaints, by definition, someone from outside the laboratory is reporting their dissatisfaction with something that they received or did not receive. A report recall, when the laboratory recognizes erroneous results, like, for example, after a failed QC, and you go back and look at test results only to see that perhaps some of them are not correct and need to be recalled and corrected, and then the laboratory incurs any of the consequences from that. For example, did the practitioner take any diagnosis or treatment action on the patient as a result of the wrong results? And then there are misdiagnoses, and there are two problems there. The cost of not receiving a treatment, like, for example, the diagnosis was benign when it really was malignant and the patient didn't receive a timely cancer treatment. And then the flip side of that is a diagnosis of malignant when really it was benign and the patient received a very discomforting and trying treatment erroneously. And the cost of the misdiagnosis does not include the patient's emotional distress. And lawsuits. They're not common from medical laboratories, but when they occur, usually due to a misdiagnosis, they are very costly for whatever reason. So we've gone through the 4 types of quality costs. You can see here, failure costs have 2 red lights because external failure costs, we really, really want to avoid those. Now we're going to talk about aspects of quality costs in the laboratory and work our way towards some specific examples. So when we compare prevention, appraisal, and failure costs, it's not exactly a logarithmic relationship, but there are solid data from business and industry that clearly show this type of relationship. So first, let's say a prevention in your laboratory costs 10 units. Because we're all from different countries, those units are whatever your monetary currency is. And let's say a prevention effort, a defect prevention effort, like designing a process or working through a checklist to make sure everything is ready to go before you go live, costs 10 units. And we do prevention before we start the work of a new or changed process in the live environment. And then we add to that, we have to determine whether that process is working as intended. And those are appraisal costs. And appraisal costs cost somewhat more. It's the cost of inspection and testing to catch and correct defects. So remember, we have quality control and proficiency testing and ongoing competence assessment and external accreditation assessment, and those cost more than the prevention effort. But together, prevention plus appraisal is always, always less than the cost of failure, which is many times more. And remember, I said it's not necessarily logarithmic, but the data from business and industry show that it is many times more. When the customer finds the defect, is unhappy with the service, when there's a misdiagnosis, when there's a lawsuit, and you can calculate hard dollars, but you can never calculate the cost of the laboratory's lost reputation, the loss of confidence in laboratory services, perhaps the loss of customers if your laboratory does work for other laboratories like physician office laboratories, and certainly the emotional distress of all the people involved in an external failure. So when we compare the costs of quality, it's really important when you look at your laboratory's budget to see and understand that prevention and appraisal are always going to be less than what it's costing you in failure, and that you should not balk at budgeting for prevention costs, such as planning and training and designing good processes, and the appraisal costs. People complain about having to budget for the cost of proficiency testing and quality control, and no one likes to do ongoing competence assessment and external accreditation assessments. That's money well spent. So it's important that you focus on the green and the good quality costs. So now I'm flipping this around and asking you a question. In whatever country you're from, in whatever monetary units you use, what's the cost of quality in your laboratory? That's the main question. And if you are in charge of the laboratory's budget, have you identified on that budget which costs are prevention, which costs are for appraisal? Have you identified which costs on your budget are for internal and external failures? From the examples I provided, you should at least be able to go to a copy of your budget and identify prevention and appraisal costs. I strongly encourage you to do that. However, you should quickly notice there is no budget line item that says failure cost. We budgeted 100,000 monetary units this year for our failure costs. There's no budget line item for failure costs. These costs are buried in your laboratory's operating budget, and they can cause you to be over budget, but you can't pinpoint why. Every time you have to redo a test run, let's say 100 tests, or the laboratory has to recollect samples that were not collected properly the first time, you're using labor and you're using supplies. Where does that come from? It comes from your budget. And so your budget for labor goes up in time and perhaps over time, and your budget for supplies and disposables goes up, and that just goes into the operating line items for your laboratory's budget. And pretty soon you are approaching or you're over budget, and when you're asked to explain that, you won't be able to explain it. So now we're going to move on and get much more specific and show you how you can calculate failure costs in your laboratory. Because as we said, you can go to your budget and calculate the appraisal and prevention costs. So now we're going to look at what goes into the cost of a laboratory process when it's done correctly and then when there's a failure. So we have this table here, and let me explain it to you. Down the left-hand blue column that's titled Common Activities. And these are the activities that happen from the point that you discover a failure all the way through completing a report about that failure. And that list on the left-hand side includes pre-examination, examination, and post-examination activities, pre-analytic, analytic, and post-analytic activities, meaning it accounts for if you have to do the tests over. The first column that says done correctly the first time represents what you budgeted for. You budgeted to do the pre-examination, examination, and post-examination costs correctly the first time. So you have perhaps specimen collection personnel, you have specimen receiving and accessioning personnel, you have the testing personnel, you have the post-examination costs of reviewing reports and releasing reports. That's what you expect to have. That's what you budget for. Now let's move one more column to the right, the middle light blue column that says additional work due to process failure. Now something happened that you didn't expect. You need to, you have discovered the failure, and it shows here the abbreviation NCE for non-conforming event. And you are required to create a report of that non-conforming event. So someone stops the work they're doing and they fill out a report. And then they have to take some kind of immediate action. If a report's been lost, we have to replace the report. If a specimen's been broken, the specimen has to be recollected, and so on. And then you see 3 lines for pre-exam, exam, and post-exam that say depends on the failure. And that means if you have to collect the specimen and or do the test over again. So of course, the type of non-conforming event is going to determine whether you have to repeat the specimen recollection, the specimen reaccessioning, repeating the test, repeating the interpretation, and review and release of the results. But then there's the cost underneath that where the X it lines up with investigation. Someone has to investigate, how did this happen, this non-conforming event, and why did this non-conforming event happen? And then skip to the bottom where you have to finish the non-conforming event report. Not every non-conforming event has a root cause analysis and a corrective action. All non-conforming events have a report and an immediate action. And based on the type of non-conforming event, your laboratory may or may not have to have the specimen recollected and redo the test. Now, on the very last column to the right, it says possible additional work for the failure. And in the case of what's called a sentinel event, or something very severe that has happened, or very costly, and having that happen again would be just really terrible. There is the cost of a root cause analysis and a corrective action, meaning to redesign the process to ensure that the non-conforming event does not recur. We're not preventing occurrence. We are eliminating or reducing recurrence for something like a sentinel event, and then the completion of the sentinel event report. And that's where the monetary units really start to stack up. So this is how the failure cost elements are calculated. And what we're going to do now is to build, let me stop here and put this last little quote up here. So I say again, budgets don't have a failure cost category. All that money is built into your current operational performance. You get enough failure costs, you will be over budget and you won't be able to explain why. So now we're going to build a basic worksheet that's generic, and it will show you how to calculate a failure cost, and use this worksheet to, I will use this worksheet to show you an example of a failure cost for a failed instrument examination. So here's what the whole worksheet looks like, and we're going to work through these pieces one at a time. So the first piece was reagents and material, this piece is labor, and this piece is called total cost. We calculate the cost only for the failed process, meaning having to do it over again. We don't include the cost of initially performing the process because your budget was the money you set aside to do it right the first time. Only it didn't go right, and now you have to do it over. And so the worksheet is for calculating the cost of the failed process. Every time the process is repeated, the money in your budget for doing it right the first time is smaller. And that's what gets you over budget. If you remember the old game Pac-Man, it's like the little Pac-Man. Every time there's a failure, the Pac-Man chomps up a few more of the dots in the line. And that money is not available for you to do other work. So how can you use this worksheet? You can calculate the cost of a single failure or a group of failures. You can estimate the cost because business and industry has shown it is not important to be exactly to the penny or the monetary unit. Reasonable, good estimate still gives you a good idea of where your money is being spent. And then lastly, you can use the failure cost to communicate the financial effects of a failure or a group of failures. And it's a very good learning tool for laboratory personnel to understand what goes into the cost of a failure. Now I'm going to work through each of the three pieces of this worksheet as regards a failed examination run. So in this top part of the worksheet, on the left-hand side, it says reagents and materials. And then across the top, we describe the item, then the item cost, the quantity used, and the total. So this is a spreadsheet, and it's built to do the math. So reagents and materials, you list individually when you can each reagent and material used for repeating the failed process. So in this case, we have to repeat a batch of tests. It looks like we have to repeat a batch of 100 patient samples, 3 calibrators, and 3 controls. And then there are pipette tips and transfer tubes in this particular methodology, which is a manually loaded test. Now, I need to tell you, none of these costs or amounts represent any specific laboratory. It's an example we created to demonstrate the worksheet. So you have each line item there, and then we put the item cost, which you can calculate from your purchasing orders, and the quantity used, and then the spreadsheet has formulas in the total column to do the math. And you can see in this particular instance of 106 repeated tests, the cost of reagents and materials subtotal is $132 and 97 cents. I'm going to use US as an example, but you can build the worksheet in your own currency. Now we're going to look at the middle part of the worksheet, or the labor costs of the worksheet, again, for the failed instrument examination. So down the left-hand side, we have the different job titles and then that are involved in doing the repeat. Remember, not doing it right the first time, doing the repeat. Then the second column is the labor cost per hour. And then the third column is the tenths of an hour, with a tenth of an hour being 6 minutes, the tenths of an hour spent in doing that activity, and then the spreadsheet calculates the total. So we have the job title involved in the failed process. And in this example, there were testing personnel, a supervisor who had to oversee the fact that there was a failed instrument examination and needed to take a look at what that meant. Then there was testing personnel hands-on time to do it all over again. And then the supervisor reviewing the action. So the troubleshooting, the additional troubleshooting, doing the tests over again, and then ensuring that the troubleshooting was successful before releasing the repeated test results. And then the labor costs per hour, and they're just kind of plugged in there, whatever it is in your country. We exclude benefit costs unless your laboratory's accountant chooses to put them in there. It's better to just put the raw labor cost in there. The portion in tenths of an hour, remember 6 minutes is 1/10 of an hour. You can estimate this, or you might have some workload data to show more accurately what that time involved is. I know that many of my clients used the non-conforming event report, had a little box on there that to capture the troubleshooting time or the supervisor review of troubleshooting. There were little boxes that said less than 15 minutes, 15 to 30 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes, 45 to 60 minutes, greater than 60 minutes. And by having that on the non-conforming event reporting form can give you some idea of the tenths of an hour to put in this third column. And then the spreadsheet calculates the labor times the time to give you the amount. And the third part of the worksheet here is where we calculate total costs. Again, this is for the failed instrument examination. So let me go back once. So let me go over to the total column. Go to the total column on the far right. And the first row is basic failure cost, $169.97. And that is the sum of the reagents and materials plus the labor costs from the previous two slides. The sum of the reagent materials and the labor costs came to $169.97. What are these two other costs here? Lost revenue and lost opportunity. Let me explain those to you. Lost revenue cost means you had 100 tests, you could not report the results, meaning in a country that charges the patient or charges the patient's insurance or charges a company for the cost of doing the test, you're not going to get that money. You're not going to be able to charge for it because you couldn't release the result. Therefore, you don't get that money. And it's the profit you would have gotten, which is net revenue over direct cost. So let's say for this example, if you look at the lost revenue cost line, it says $100, and that assumes that for each of the 100 tests, there was a $1 margin or profit that your laboratory will not get. Even though you did the test, you will not get the money because you can't report the results. And so that's money not coming into the laboratory. Now, the lost opportunity cost is the basic failure cost. So it's the same as the basic failure cost, $169.97 goes into that place because you spent the money out of your budget and now you don't have the money to do 100 more tests that were scheduled to be in the budget. This is where the little Pac-Man eats up a couple of dots on the line. That money's gone. So you've lost the money to do a set of 100 tests the first time on a different set of specimens. And that's how you get over budget. Your lost opportunity costs pile up and pile up until you're over budget. Now, your laboratory can choose to include these costs or not. Some accountants don't want you to, but you can. And when you do, in this particular example, it's not just $169.97. It comes to $439.94. That's a bit higher. That's significantly higher. That's real money, and it starts to pile up. So here's the whole worksheet in one place when you build the spreadsheet in a spreadsheet program, and the entire worksheet demonstrates the cost of a failed examination run. And so you see the reagent material cost bar, $132.97. The labor cost was $37 because it was an automated instrument. And in this case, for automated instruments, labor is a lot less, and the labor here represents investigating the failure, not so much doing the test over. And then the very bottom row, total costs, is adding in the lost revenue and lost opportunity costs. And the very bottom right orange cube is the total failure cost for that one batch of 100 tests that you did and you can't report the results. So remember, you only calculate for the failed process because your budget included the money to do it right the first time, but it didn't get done right the first time. You can build your laboratories, this worksheet on a spreadsheet program. And the reason is there's no software out there, and I'll get back to that in a minute. Now we're going to use the worksheet to calculate the failed cost for a repeated blood specimen collection. And I did not break this one out into 3 parts, so I'm just going to direct your attention to the 3 parts of the worksheet, and we'll walk through them. So the first green set of rows is reagents and materials costs, and the materials listed there, the specimen labels, tubes, needles, alcohol wipes, bandages, and whatever else it takes to recollect the specimen. And then the item cost, which can be calculated from your laboratory's purchasing orders, the number, the quantity used. In this case, we have to recollect 1 patient, but 3 different tubes of specimen from that one blood collection. And then the spreadsheet calculates out the item cost times the quantity used. And you can see that the reagent material subtotal is a small amount, a couple dollars, $2.27. Now let's look at the labor cost. And in the first column, we list the job titles of the people involved in the failure, in doing it over again. So we have the specimen processor identifying a mislabeled specimen that cannot go further to be tested. And the specimen processor has to initiate a non-conforming event report and notify the patient's nurse that we're going to need another specimen. And the specimen processor also has to take time to notify the phlebotomist to recollect the specimens. And then there's the phlebotomist job title, and that person recollects the specimens. But then the specimen processor has to reprocess the recollected specimens. And the supervisor has time to review the non-conforming event report at his or her wage. And the supervisor investigates. In this case, it's a mislabeling event, which is serious and could cause a very serious external failure if this had not been caught and corrected in the laboratory. So we're catching it and correcting it as an internal failure. But mislabeling is serious enough to have an investigation. What went wrong in the process that this specimen's got mislabeled? And then there are the labor costs in hours, the portions of hours in tenths, and then the spreadsheet calculates the extension, and you get a labor subtotal of $30.10. Look at that. It's 15 times higher than the specimens. This is completely different than the failed test run, where the labor wasn't very much at all because it was an automated test, and it was the supplies and reagents that had the higher cost. So here, if you go down to the third green row, total costs, we have not put in a lost revenue or a lost opportunity cost. In this case, the laboratory accountant didn't want them in there. So the basic failure cost is the total failure cost. So to recollect 1 patient, 3 tubes of blood, $32.37 in this example. And I challenge you, how many recollected blood specimens do you have in your laboratory every month at something approximating that cost? So in this kind of example, specimen processing, the pre-examination activities of specimen collection, specimen processing, the failure costs are primarily labor, and there are different job titles involved. So these labor costs really add up and make your labor over budget, either due to overtime in doing all this work over again, or just the mere volume of having to do all this work over again. And you can reduce the failure here by having the number of recollections or mislabels reduced, but you don't get any personnel reduction. You can't save FTEs by reducing these failures. And that's important issue. So what a lowered recollection rate allows is for your people to do more work correctly the first time instead of spending their time doing work over again. That's why it's important. Now we're going to work through a completely different spreadsheet. This is one that applies failure costs to common laboratory quality indicators. So we can use the failure cost worksheet for when tests don't work properly, when there's an invalid test run or an incomplete test run. This worksheet helps you calculate the total failure costs for a period of time for mostly pre-examination and post-examination. So it includes pre-exam and post-exam. And I'll walk you through this. So let me explain the structure of this first. This is a laboratory failure cost summary report. In the white row across the top, there are 12 months. So this is an annual report, but it will be built month by month. And then there's a column for monthly average, and there's a threshold column, which means this is what you would like your performance to be. And then the failure cost. So you've used the failure cost worksheet to calculate the failure cost for one incident of this happening. Then you're collecting the monthly totals for how many times that thing happened that month, and you're building this annual spreadsheet month by month. Down the left-hand column, we have, in this particular example, 3 quality indicators. A quality indicator is a process measurement in the United States, plus also in any ISO 15189 accredited laboratories. The laboratory's required to measure key process performance. So on the left-hand side here, we have pre-examination, the number of specimen collection events. And right underneath that, it says estimated failure cost average is about $30 per collection. Remember from our spreadsheet on the previous page, it was about $32. So we're going to round it down and say about $30 per collection. Below that is the one example of an examination indicator. You've used the failure cost worksheet to calculate the failed instrument run, the cost of a failed instrument run. And the estimated failure cost, we said, was about $400 for 100 tests. And below that is it's the corrected reports. So after the examination results have been reported, it's the number of corrected reports. A customer calls and says, this is the wrong result, or you notice it after a QC or calibration failure, and you have to recall and correct the reports. And we didn't show an example of a spreadsheet for this, but we've calculated to be on average about $25 per corrected report. Now let's work our way across, go back up to pre-examination, the first green row, the number of specimen recollection events by month. And you can read across, and there are a whole bunch of yellow boxes. Why are those boxes yellow? Because if you work your way all the way over to the right where it says threshold, your target performance is less than 150 recollections a month. And in every box where it's yellow, you're over 150. So not only are you approaching being over budget, you're not meeting your set performance of less than 100, fewer than 150 recollection events per month in, look at this, 10 out of 12 months of the year. So there's a process problem there. There's something wrong that's causing specimens to have to be corrected. And if you look at the failure costs month by month by month, using $30 as the average cost. For the year, you have a nice chunk of $62,000 in failure costs. And those are real labor and material dollars. The same for the examination row, working your way across. You can see 9 out of the 12 months, you are over your target of fewer than 15 failed instrument runs per month. Because these were examinations and you're not going to have any profit and you're eating up the money to do it right the first time, you have $85,000 in failure costs for the year. And below that, a number of corrected reports. There are a number of months there that are outside your threshold of fewer than 75 corrected reports per month. And you put all that, the number of corrected reports, this is labor. And you add all that up and you get another 22,000. And so in this one small worksheet of only 3 indicators, your laboratories hit about $170,000 in failure costs for the year. And I will tell you that is a really low estimate of what your failure cost really is, because these are only 3 indicators and there are many processes that can be and are monitored in a quality assurance program. So I chose these indicators because they're the most common laboratory failure costs, and I would encourage you to start here, start with these 3, and calculate the best estimate of your failure cost using the failure cost worksheet. And I just want to say, for repeated test runs, that includes invalid and incomplete test run, because you have to do it over again, whatever the reason is. So we want you to collect the monthly occurrence data on these failures, and remember the threshold, and do color the boxes when you're outside your threshold, because it draws attention to the fact that that process is or is not working the way you intend. You have to build this spreadsheet yourself, but I've given you some pretty clear instructions for how to do that. I would encourage you to make this a part of your laboratory's internal quality report. Keep these data inside the laboratory. This is not something you want to show administration, particularly when this particular report shows that so many of your processes are not in good control. And what you need to do is take action to reduce failure. And you'll know that you're reducing failure when the yellow boxes start to turn white. And you'll know that you're reducing failure when you reduce your thresholds to create continual improvement. You want those threshold numbers to be smaller as time goes by. And then, of course, track your progress. And I'll say again, make sure you keep this information inside the laboratory to start with, so that you don't want to report this to your administration right away. Moving on now towards the end. So what can your laboratory do? You can build spreadsheets from the models shown here. There are commercially available electronic cost of quality software programs, but they are designed for business and manufacturing and industry. And there is no program specifically for medical laboratories. So you have to, at this point, build your own spreadsheets. They're not hard to build. We've showed you how. So start by calculating the failure cost of one common problem. And I gave you 3 examples. Specimen recollections, which are a huge part of your budget, whether you realize it or not. Failed instrument runs, all instruments across your laboratory, and that will probably be a big number. And a really important one is corrected reports. Why? Because that's your laboratory's product. You manufacture that report of results from biologic raw materials. That's the product you send out the door. And that's the product that the customer is going to catch, or heaven forbid, the practitioner takes the wrong action on a patient as a result of a wrong report or wrong results on a report. So that's a really important one to track, because that is a failure you really want to reduce significantly. Don't be surprised if you use this worksheet and you find that the failure costs are high. Even without the lost opportunity cost and the lost revenue cost, the cost of a failure will be high. And then last, I think it's really important that not only you as managers, supervisors, directors, administrators learn about quality cost. We need to teach these concepts to all laboratory personnel. We can show them the spreadsheet. We can show them the effects of what happens when things don't go right the first time. And it helps people be more mindful and respectful of the cost of waste and laboratory errors and problems, because money spent on waste and laboratory errors and problems is not available for doing good things in the laboratory, like upgrading equipment or going to conferences or obtaining new software or adjusting personnel wages for the better. So I want to give you some information about the newest quality resource, laboratory cost of quality resource. This is the cover of the Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute guideline, QMS 20, entitled Cost of Quality in Medical Laboratories. And there is also a companion online learning course for this program. The good news is the second edition is going to be released in November, which is only a couple of days away. And so the second edition has been updated to provide for you more spreadsheets, more examples. The guideline is organized in two parts, theory and application. And so the theory part goes through all the prevention, appraisal, failure cost types, and then more than the second half of the document is application to medical laboratory examples with more different spreadsheet types. I said again, there's no commercial programs available for medical laboratories, so the spreadsheet examples in the guidelines show you how to build these spreadsheets. Our moderator told you that I served as the co-chairperson for writing this guideline. We do CLSI committee work as volunteers. So we do not get any kind of payment or royalties from sales of this guideline. Therefore, I can, in good conscience, recommend that your laboratory acquires a copy of this document, because it will help you reduce your failure costs. So thank you for attending this Labroots education program. Now it's time to see if you have any questions. Thank you and good day.
And thank you, Lucy, for that informative presentation. And we will now start the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on that Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen. So let's get started. Lucy, it looks like we already have some great questions coming in from our audience. Our first question, how do I know if I have enough prevention and appraisal processes?
Okay, that's a very good question. Your prevention process starts with the design of your laboratory's pre-examination, examination, and post-examination processes. So if you want enough prevention processes, when you have a new instrument, when you have a new computer system, when you have a new anything, or when you change anything, the prevention process is to have a formal means to make that change, to think about all aspects of that process, every aspect of pre-analytic, analytic, and post-analytic about the new or changed process, and what needs to happen to make sure that goes right the first time. So prevention is all about design. If you want the word that equals prevention, in my opinion, the word is design. If you design it to meet requirements, then it's highly likely to go right the first time. Now, how do you know if you have enough appraisal processes? Well, regulatory and accreditation requirements give you a good start because quality control is mandated, ongoing competence assessment is mandated, proficiency testing is mandated. Most countries mandate some kind of licensing or accreditation, external accreditation, where you're given a set of requirements and you have to meet them. But there are some internal appraisal processes your laboratory should have, and quality assurance, meaning quality indicators, is one of them. Do you measure processes, not because you have to, but because you want to know what's going on? And the second one is it is part of the International Medical Laboratory Standard and not as popular in the United States as it could be or should be. It's called internal audit, but the laboratory community is moving in that direction. And that's where your laboratory's internal auditors look at your own processes, watch people do work and see if they're going according to the approved process and procedure documents. And are you getting the outcomes from those processes that you have planned for and you expect? So prevention is design and appraisal. Some of that's given to you by requirement, and some of it you do because you want to know how well you're doing. And that's when you'll know you have enough. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. And Lucy, is there a way to quantify external failure costs?
As I mentioned, the external failure costs are big. Lawsuits, misdiagnoses, those are huge. Let's start with the smaller one, like a complaint. A complaint is a non-conforming event. Your laboratory is required to have a means to capture complaints. If you capture complaints, I mentioned earlier in the program, part of that reporting form could just be a little tick box about how much time different people involved in the complaint spent resolving their part of the complaint. And that can give you a way to calculate the cost of a complaint. You can also calculate the cost of a corrected report. You can use the failure cost worksheet for the labor part, where you can calculate the cost to rectify a corrected report based on the different job titles involved. Those are two of the external failure costs that are easier. When it comes to misdiagnoses and lawsuits, I don't think you can even begin to calculate the volume of money involved in that, because as soon as the organization's legal aspect gets involved, the costs are astronomical. And that's about the best answer I can give you. Go for what you know. You can do complaints and corrected reports, and those are the most common laboratory external failures.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And I want to thank our audience members for these great questions coming in. We have time for a few more. Where do I record root causes analysis and corrective actions costs in my worksheet?
Well, it's a good question, but the worksheet's not meant to calculate root cause analysis and corrective action. A root cause analysis is a project. There's going to be a set of people. You're going to look at the existing process that did not work correctly. You're going to dissect that process to find out what went wrong and why it went wrong. This is usually a series of meetings. Sometimes these meetings don't take very long and you can nail the root cause fairly quickly. And sometimes there are people involved in the root cause outside the laboratory's walls, like nurses, perhaps, and surgeons or radiology or messengers, hospital messengers or nurse, patient care technician personnel. And they're hard to get involved in a root cause analysis project that emanates from the laboratory. So you can't use the worksheet for these, and it will be difficult to calculate the cost of a root cause analysis project, but I'll tell you, it's going to be high. Why? Because we're talking about labor. We're not talking about yellow stickies on brown paper or the cost of the markers to work on a whiteboard. We're talking about people sitting in meetings for hours until we determine the root cause. So good question, but that's not what the worksheet's meant for.
Thank you so much. Our next audience member asks, I know I will always have some QC failures in the future, which I have a troubleshoot. How can I include this in a laboratory budget?
Okay, no laboratory is perfect. And you're right, there will be some QC failures as time goes on. So how do you know how do you put them in the budget? I would calculate the cost of one failure. You look at your historic experience. So if you've been keeping track of these over the months and years, you should have a pretty good idea how often this happens. If you're not keeping track, you can't guess. So you're going to have to calculate proactively by starting today and keeping track as time goes on. How many did we have this month and next month? If you have historical data, you can look back. So you could calculate on the worksheet what one of them costs, look at your historic experience. But you know what? You don't want to have those failures at all. So it's not like you want to plan to put a lot of money in QC failure into your budget. So you look at how many have happened if you have historical data and say, is this a reasonable number? Is this an unreasonable number? Can this number be reduced? And unfortunately, in the global laboratory community, there are no benchmarks. There's no published data on what people's experience with failed QC runs or failed calibration of incomplete test runs, invalid test run. Nobody reports those in a journal or puts that information online. Nobody's going to air their dirty laundry in public. So there's no way for you to gauge except by your laboratory's historical experience. So take your historical experience, calculate one failure cost, but ask yourself the question, is this reasonable experience? Can we reduce it? That's our threshold. Make that number go down. And that's about all I can share with you on that because there's no published data.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question, Lucy. Can we just assume that failure costs are going to be a part of the process?
Okay, well, I'm sorry, but that sounds to me like you're planning for failure instead of planning for quality. So I don't want you to assume failure costs are part of your process. Prevention is design. Laboratory management is responsible for designing the pre-examination, examination, and post-examination processes to meet requirements, regulatory requirements, accreditation requirements, reasonable customer requirements, and any organization requirements. That's labs management's responsibility to design those processes. If you're not designing your processes, you're not doing your job correctly. And so if you're focusing on assuming failure costs are part of your process, you've got the whole thing backwards. So let me share a quick little story with you. This is true. A United States company contracted with a company in Japan to make some parts for them. They wanted 10,000 parts with a 0.0003% error. That's 3 parts in 10,000 parts. They didn't want any more error than that. US says to Japan, make us these parts with this specification. So when the order arrives at the US company, they open up the box, and on top of the box of 10,000 parts is a little bitty box. And inside that box are 3 pieces that are out of specification. And the Japanese said, Well, we gave you what you wanted, and we don't understand why you wanted us to make 3 pieces that didn't fit, but this is what your specification was, so this is what we're giving you. Do you see what that means there? The US was planning for failure, but the Japanese planned for no failure, and they achieved no failure. And then, curious as to why the US would want parts out of spec, gave them what they wanted, even though that's not what they needed. So again, I'll encourage you, planning. Prevention is planning and design. That's where laboratory management needs to focus on every single process in the laboratory. And I hope that answers your question. You might not like it.
That's a great answer, Lucy. Thank you again for this incredible presentation and for your time today. And before we go, I want to thank our audience members for joining us today and for their questions. Questions we did not have time for today will be answered and posted in the event resources by November 27th. And this webcast will be available on demand in the auditorium from Friday on. If you found this informative and helpful, please share it with your colleagues, and please check back regularly on the topics, and remember to take a look at the booths in the exhibit hall of the virtual conference. Until next time, take care, be safe, stay healthy. Bye-bye.